Evelyn Whitmore snatched the pen from Claire's hand before she could even finish signing her name. "Don't embarrass yourself by dragging this out," Evelyn said, her voice dripping with contempt. "You came into this family with nothing. Leave the same way." She slid the divorce papers across the mahogany table like she was sliding a dinner receipt toward a waitress she had already decided not to tip. Nobody in that room knew they were dismissing a woman who could buy everything they owned twice before breakfast. Before we go further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now and follow this story all the way to the end. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. The storm came without warning that October night. Not the kind that weathermen predict 3 days in advance and people stock up for. This was the kind that arrives fast, hits hard, and tears through everything that wasn't built on solid ground. By the time the thunder cracked over the Whitmore estate, the rain was already hammering the floor-to-ceiling windows of the great hall like it had a personal grudge. Claire Morgan stood in front of those windows for a long time before anyone called her into the room. She wasn't watching the storm. She was saying goodbye to it. 7 years. 7 years of standing at windows in this house, looking out at things she was never quite allowed to be part of. Garden parties she was told to just smile through. Business dinners where Evelyn sat Claire at the far end of the table, close enough to appear present, far enough to be forgotten. Charity galas where Andrew's mother introduced her to donors as Andrew's wife. Never by name, never with warmth, always with that small pause before wife that made it clear the word itself was being used reluctantly. 7 years of windows, and now she was standing at the last one. "Claire," Andrew's voice came from the hallway, not sharp, not gentle, just the voice of a man who had somewhere better to be. "They're ready for you." She didn't turn around right away. She pressed one hand flat against the cold glass and felt the rain vibrating against her palm through the pane. Outside, the oak trees in the garden were bending in the wind, even the oldest ones, even the ones that had been there 100 years before the Whitmore family planted their flag on this land and started calling it a legacy. Everything bends eventually, she thought. The question is whether you break. "I'm coming," she said. She turned away from the window and walked toward the room where her marriage would officially end. The great hall of the Whitmore estate was designed to make a person feel small. That was not an accident. Richard Whitmore Sr., Andrew's grandfather, had commissioned the architecture specifically to inspire a particular emotional response in guests, the quiet, creeping recognition that they were standing inside something larger than themselves. The ceilings were 22 feet high. The chandelier alone cost more than most people's homes. The portraits on the walls were not decorative. They were a message. Every face in every gilded frame said the same thing. "We have always been here. We will always be here. You are temporary." Claire had walked through that room for 7 years without ever quite getting used to it. Tonight it felt different. Tonight it felt small. 4 people sat around the conference table that had been moved into the center of the hall for this specific occasion. Andrew at the head because, of course. His mother Evelyn to his right because she belonged wherever power sat. James Calloway, the family's attorney, with his reading glasses pushed down his nose and a stack of documents in front of him that represented the legal dismantling of a marriage. And finally, a young associate Claire didn't recognize sitting very still with a pen in her hand and the expression of someone who had witnessed uncomfortable things before and learned to make their face neutral. There was no seat for Claire's attorney, because Claire had not brought one. She had known she wouldn't need one. "Close the door," Evelyn said, before Claire had fully entered the room. Not to Claire, to a staff member standing near the entrance. Evelyn did not look at Claire when she spoke, which was something she had perfected over 7 years, the art of speaking in someone's presence without acknowledging their presence. It was a skill that required practice. Evelyn had put in the hours. Claire closed the door herself. She walked to the empty chair across from Andrew and sat down. For a moment, nobody said anything. The thunder outside rattled the windows. The chandelier trembled slightly. The rain intensified. Andrew cleared his throat. "Claire," he started, "I know this is difficult, and I want you to know that regardless of how things ended between us, I have the utmost respect for—" "Andrew." Her voice was quiet, not soft. Quiet. There's a difference. Soft is yielding. Quiet is controlled. "You don't have to do that." He blinked. "Do what?" The speech. I've heard the draft version twice already. I know how it ends. She pulled the stack of documents toward her. Can we just do this? James Calloway looked at Andrew over his reading glasses. Andrew's jaw tightened slightly. He was not accustomed to being interrupted, especially not by Claire, who for most of their marriage had spoken in complete, careful sentences that never overlapped with his. The interruption was small, but it landed wrong. Of course, Andrew said. Evelyn, to her son's right, had not moved. She was watching Claire with the particular attention of someone trying to detect a flaw in a performance, looking for the trembling lip, the reddening eyes, the signs that this composed exterior was about to crack and reveal the devastated woman underneath. She was waiting for Claire to fall apart. She was certain it was coming. It was only a matter of when. Claire picked up the pen. James Calloway began walking her through the documents. Page 1. The dissolution of the marriage filed in the state of New York citing irreconcilable differences. Claire read it. She did not skim it. She read every word because she had always been someone who read the whole thing, even when others were shifting impatiently in their seats. She signed. Page 7. The financial settlement agreement. James cleared his throat before he read this section, which was his. He always cleared his throat before delivering news. He expected to generate a reaction. The settlement offered Claire a one-time payment of $2.3 million, the use of a company vehicle for 1 year, and temporary housing assistance for 6 months while she transitioned. $2.3 million for 7 years. The math was approximately $328,000 per year, less than the cost of the chandelier hanging above their heads. That's the offer on the table, James said carefully. Of course you're entitled to legal representation before I decline, Claire said. The room went very still. Even the storm outside seemed to pause. I'm sorry, James said. The settlement. I decline it. She turned to the next page. What else? Andrew leaned forward. Claire, that's you should talk to a lawyer before you... I don't need a lawyer, Andrew. She kept turning pages. I just need a pen. Evelyn, for the first time in the entire meeting, spoke directly to Claire. You declined $2 million. Her tone was not surprised. It was amused in the way that a person is amused when they watch someone do something they consider profoundly foolish. On principle, on preference, Claire said without looking up. That is the most... Evelyn stopped, recalibrated. When she spoke again, the amusement was still there, sharpened at the edges. You do understand that if you walk out of here tonight without signing that agreement, you walk out with nothing. You came into this family with nothing, and you will leave with nothing. Do you understand that? Claire looked up from the documents. She looked directly at Evelyn Whitmore, and she held that gaze for a beat longer than Evelyn was comfortable with. I understand completely, Claire said. She turned back to the pages. Page 12, the residence agreement. The Whitmore family was prepared to allow Claire to remain in the Manhattan apartment, not the estate. The apartment for a period of 90 days, while she arranged alternative housing. It was technically generous. The apartment was worth $4 million. 90 days was more than enough time for most people. The apartment, James said. That one at minimum we strongly recommend. No. The associate with the neutral face looked up for the first time. No, James repeated. I don't want the apartment. Claire signed the page declining the residence arrangement. I have somewhere to stay. Andrew was staring at her with an expression she didn't have a name for. She had studied his expressions for 7 years, the tight smile he used at events when he was bored, the particular flatness that came over his face when his mother said something he agreed with, but didn't want to visibly agree with the way he looked at her across dinner tables in the early years, before things changed, before the warmth in his eyes got replaced by something cooler and more transactional. She knew his face the way you know the layout of a house you've lived in too long. But this expression was new. This was something she hadn't seen before. This was confusion edged with something that might in a different person have been called worry. What do you mean you have somewhere to stay? He asked. Exactly what I said. Claire. He lowered his voice. Not for privacy. The room was sealed. The staff had been dismissed. There was no one to overhear. He lowered it because he was shifting into the tone he used when he was trying to have an actual conversation with her, the tone she hadn't heard in maybe 3 years. Where are you going? She placed the pen down on the table, carefully, the way you set something down when you're done with it and don't intend to pick it up again. Andrew, she said, we are signing divorce papers in the family hall on a Tuesday night while your mother watches to make sure I don't take anything that's nailed down. This is not the moment for you to be concerned about where I'm going. He opened his mouth. He closed it. Point to Claire. Evelyn made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Let her go, Andrew. The performance is getting exhausting. She reached across the table and pulled the remaining documents toward herself, checking Claire's signatures, the way you check the work of someone you don't quite trust. She's trying to look dignified. Let her have it. I'm not trying to look anything, Claire said pleasantly. No. Evelyn didn't look up from the papers. Then what do you call refusing a $2 million settlement on a Tuesday night in the middle of a rainstorm? Practical. I call it accurate, Claire said. Accurate. The settlement amount doesn't reflect what 7 years of my life were worth. It reflects what you thought I was worth when you wrote the check. Those are different numbers. She picked up her copy of the final signature page, signed it, slid it back across the table. And since you're the ones who will have to live with what you thought, not me, I see no reason to argue about it. The silence that followed was different from the earlier silences. The earlier ones had been tense, electric, the kind of silence that has things moving underneath it. This one was just empty. Evelyn set the papers down. She looked at her son. Andrew looked at the signed documents. The associate with the neutral face was very carefully not looking at anyone. James Calloway removed his reading glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Outside, the storm was passing. The thunder had moved east. The rain was still falling, but it had lost its violence. The oak trees in the garden had straightened themselves. Claire stood up. She pushed her chair back evenly, the way someone pushes back from a table at the end of a meal, completing a thing, not fleeing from it. She picked up the single document she was keeping, a copy of the dissolution, her signature in blue ink at the bottom, her name in full, her handwriting steady. Claire. Andrew's voice again. Different this time. Something had shifted in it. She couldn't tell if it was genuine or if it was performance, and she realized with a clarity that surprised her that she no longer cared which it was. You're really doing this. We already did it, she said. The papers are signed. That's not what I mean. He pushed back from his own chair, stood. And for a moment he was just a man standing in a very expensive room in the middle of the night while the rain came down, and he looked for just that moment, like someone who had just realized something he couldn't name yet. I mean, are you going to be okay? The question landed strange. Not cruel, not calculated, just strange, poorly timed, arriving 7 years too late in some ways and all at once in this moment, in a way that felt less like concern and more like a man checking a box. He hadn't thought to check until the box was about to close forever. Claire looked at her ex-husband for what she knew would be one of the last times she would be in a room with him, without lawyers or press or public ceremony as a buffer. Andrew, she said quietly, I have never been better. She walked out of the great hall, past the portraits, past the chandelier, through the entrance foyer with the marble floors and the antique mirror where she had stopped every day for 7 years to make sure she looked the part before going into whichever room of this house was going to require her to perform today. Tonight she didn't stop at the mirror. She already knew what she looked like. She walked out the front door. A car was waiting, nothing dramatic. A black sedan hired through an app the way any ordinary person would hire a car on a rainy night. The driver was a man named Gerald, who had a Philadelphia Eagles air freshener hanging from the rearview mirror and was listening to soft jazz at a volume that suggested he had picked up enough late-night passengers to know when silence was appropriate. Claire got in. The door closed. The Whitmore estate receded through the back window, its lights bright against the wet night, its silhouette enormous and solid and permanent-looking, in the way that things look permanent right before they aren't. Gerald adjusted the rearview mirror. "Airport, ma'am. Please," Claire said. She settled back into the seat. Outside New York moved past the window's wet streets reflecting red taillights, the city still awake and loud and indifferent in the best possible way. She reached into her coat pocket and found the phone she had kept deliberately silent all evening. 12 notifications, 4 from a number saved only as RAS, 7 from a contact listed as Foundation Legal, 1 from her grandfather. 1 line. Richard's messages were always 1 line. She opened it. "It read everything ready when you are. The jet fuel's at 6. She smiled, not the careful, measured smile she had trained herself to use in Whitmore spaces. the smile that said, "I am grateful to be included without demanding to be seen." This was a different smile. Private, unhurried, the smile of a woman who knows something no one else in the room knows and has known it the entire time. She typed back one word, "Good." Gerald drove. The jazz played softly. The rain was slowing down. In the Whitmore estate behind her, the lights were still blazing in the great hall. She imagined Evelyn telling the story already on the phone, with someone composing the narrative of tonight into something manageable, something that confirmed what Evelyn already believed, that Claire had been a charity project, a mistake corrected a small-town girl who had briefly borrowed a life that was never hers and now returned it appropriately with nothing to show for it. She imagined Andrew in the hallway, quiet, not quite sure what just happened. She imagined the associate with the neutral face going home and telling someone about the woman who turned down $2 million without blinking, and the person she told saying that's crazy, and the associate saying, "Yeah, but you kind of had to be there because something about it didn't look crazy. Something about it looked like the opposite." The car crossed into Manhattan. Gerald turned the jazz down a notch without being asked. Claire looked out at the city and felt for the first time in longer than she could accurately name like herself. Not the self she had learned to perform in the Whitmore world, not the careful, smaller, apologetic version of herself that had learned to take up less space so there would be room for everyone else's comfort. The self underneath all of that, the one that had been waiting patient and quiet for this exact night. She had one suitcase. She had made the choice to leave with one suitcase deliberately, not because she couldn't have taken more. She could have legally claimed a significant portion of the contents of that house, and James Calloway would have had to let her, and Evelyn would have hated every second of it. She took one suitcase because she wanted to, because the point was not to take things. The point was to leave clean. She had learned something important in 7 years inside the Whitmore world. The people who spend all their time protecting what they have eventually stop being able to imagine anything else. They build walls to guard the treasure, and then one day they realize they've been living inside a fortress and calling it a home. Andrew's family had confused those two things a long time ago. They thought the mansion was proof of their worth. They thought the settlements and the estate and the portraits in the Great Hall were what made them real. Claire had understood something different. What you walk away from without flinching, that's the thing that tells you who you are. She had walked away from $2.3 million without flinching. She had walked away from a Manhattan apartment worth $4 million. She had walked away from a name that opened doors in 42 states and 12 countries. And she had done it all without trembling, without crying, without giving Evelyn Whitmore the satisfaction of a single moment of visible despair. Not because she was performing dignity, because she didn't need any of it. Gerald pulled to a stop outside a midtown hotel. Not the Whitmore's preferred hotel, not the one where they kept a permanent suite and where the concierge knew their names. A different one. Better, honestly. Quieter. The kind of place that understood discretion because its guests required it. "Thank you, Gerald," Claire said. "Have a good night, ma'am." She stepped out into the light rain, walked through the hotel entrance, checked in under a name the front desk staff accepted without comment, took the elevator to the 14th floor, walked to the room at the end of the hall, opened the door, stepped inside. It was a good room. She set her suitcase beside the dresser. She sat on the edge of the bed and was quiet for a moment. Somewhere beneath the silence, something enormous was ending. She knew that. She gave it the weight it deserved. 7 years. A life she had tried to build inside a structure that was never designed to hold her. A love that had started as something real, and over time had been redirected not by cruelty, but by habit, by comfort, by the slow drift of a man who had never had to choose between his family's approval and his wife's dignity, and had, without ever making the choice consciously, consistently, allowed the scales to tip one way. She had loved Andrew Whitmore. That was the part she did not perform and did not pretend. She had loved him in the early years when he laughed loudly at her jokes at parties and slipped his hand into hers at formal dinners and told her once late at night on a balcony overlooking the Hudson that she was the most real person he had ever met. She had believed that. She had wanted to believe it. She had married the version of Andrew Whitmore who said things like that and meant them. But people are not one version. And the other version, the one that let his mother talk over her at board meetings, that dismissed her opinions in public with a smile that was designed to look affectionate, but was actually designed to end the conversation that had spent the last 3 years of their marriage talking to her like she was someone who needed to be managed rather than someone who needed to be loved. That version had steadily replaced the first one, and she had stayed too long. Not because she had nowhere to go, because she had wanted to be wrong about what she was seeing. She hadn't been wrong. She sat on the edge of that hotel bed and gave herself 5 minutes. 5 minutes to feel the weight of it. The marriage, the years, the quiet accumulation of moments where she had been diminished by degrees so small that each individual one was deniable. The dinners, the parties, the windows, the chandelier, the $2.3 million that was supposed to summarize what she was worth. 5 minutes. Then she stood up, picked up her phone, called a number she knew by heart. It rang twice. Claire. A man's voice, warm and old and entirely unhurried, the voice of someone who has lived long enough to understand that most things that seem urgent are not, and the things that are urgent cannot be rushed. "Are you all right?" "Grandpa," she said. "I'm all right." "How did it go?" "Exactly the way we expected." A pause. Then, with a kind of quiet satisfaction that lived beneath the surface of his words, like a current under calm water, "And the documents. Signed, all of them. I took nothing." "Good girl," he said, not condescending, the way you say it when you mean it proud, certain measuring a person against the standard you always knew they could meet. "The jet fuel's at 6. Marcus will have everything ready when you land." "I know." "You're sure you're ready for what comes next? Because what comes next, Claire, there's no going back from it. Once you walk into that gala as yourself, the other version of the story is finished." She looked out the hotel window. The rain had stopped completely. The streets below were wet and gleaming under the streetlights, every surface reflecting light that had been there all along, but had been obscured by the water. She thought about Evelyn Whitmore telling the story of tonight, the small-town girl who left with nothing, the woman who had finally gone back where she came from. She thought about Andrew standing in the great hall with that expression she hadn't seen before, the one that looked almost like worry. Almost. But not quite like it. She thought about the chandelier trembling above a table where she had been offered $2 million as a fair price for 7 years of her life. "Grandpa," she said, "yes, I've been ready for 3 years." She heard him breathe, a long breath, the kind that holds something in it, relief maybe, or vindication, or just the particular exhale of a man in his 80s who has loved someone for their entire life and has been waiting for them to remember their own name. "Then I'll see you when you land," he said. "You'll see me at the gala," she said. Another pause. And then, for the first time in a long time, she heard her grandfather laugh. Not a polite laugh, not a public laugh, a real one, deep and delighted and 70 years old, the laugh of a man who had built something enormous and cared about none of it as much as he cared about the woman on the other end of that phone call. "Then God help them," he said. "I think," Claire said, "that's precisely the right sentiment." She said goodnight, hung up, set the phone on the nightstand, opened her suitcase and found the garment bag folded carefully inside the only thing in the suitcase that required more than the practical. She unzipped it, looked at what was inside. Black, floor length, entirely simple and entirely extraordinary in the way that things made by people who know exactly what they're doing always appear to people who can't quite explain why it's stunning, but know without any doubt that it is. She had bought it 6 months ago. She had known 6 months ago how this night would end and what would need to come next. She zipped the garment bag back up and hung it on the back of the door, set an alarm for 4:30, got into bed. Outside New York, settled into the hours that belonged to no particular day, too late to be the night that was too early to be the morning that would be. Somewhere on the other side of the city, the Whitmore estate was still blazing with light. Somewhere Evelyn was composing her narrative. Somewhere Andrew was standing in a room being very quiet and not quite understanding why. Claire Morgan closed her eyes and slept without any trouble at all, because tomorrow was not a beginning. She had been working toward tomorrow for 3 years. Tomorrow was simply the moment when everyone else would finally see what she had already known. The woman they dismissed at dinner parties. The woman they corrected in board meetings. The woman they handed $2.3 million and considered generous. That woman had not been born in the Whitmore estate. She had been standing in it quietly long enough to understand exactly what it was made of. And she knew something that Evelyn Whitmore, with all her portraits and all her chandeliers and all her practiced contempt, had never thought to find out. She knew what it wasn't made of. It wasn't made of the kind of thing that lasts. She knew because she had seen what that looked like. She had grown up surrounded by it. And in 6 hours, the rest of the world would too. The alarm went off at 4:30 in the morning, and Claire was already awake. She had been lying in the dark for 20 minutes, staring at the ceiling of a hotel room that belonged to no version of her life she had ever performed for anyone else, and she felt, and this was the thing that surprised her, even though it shouldn't have completely calm. Not numb, not the hollow cotton-stuffed calm of someone who has cried themselves empty and has nothing left. Real calm, the kind that lives in the body, in the steadiness of breathing, in the way her hands were still when she reached for the lamp on the nightstand and turned it on without fumbling. She sat up. She looked at the garment bag on the back of the door. She said quietly to no one in particular, "Okay." That was all. She got up and got dressed. By 5:15, she was in the lobby. By 5:40, a car sent by the Sterling Foundation's New York office had collected her from the hotel entrance without drama, without fanfare, without a single person in the lobby looking up from their phones long enough to notice the woman in the black coat walking out with a single suitcase and the particular kind of posture that comes not from training, but from finally, after a very long time, having nothing left to carry. The driver's name was Thomas. He did not attempt conversation, which she appreciated. He drove efficiently through the pre-dawn city, through streets that belonged entirely to garbage trucks and delivery vans, and the occasional taxi heading back after a long night, and he brought her to Teterboro Airport in New Jersey in 41 minutes, without once suggesting an alternate route. The Gulfstream G700 was already on the tarmac. She saw it from the car window as they pulled through the private aviation gate, and something moved in her chest, not sentiment exactly, more like recognition. Like seeing a face in a crowd. The aircraft sat in the early dark with its cabin lights warm and its Sterling Foundation seal on the tail, understated precise, the kind of mark that means something to people who know what they're looking at and means nothing to everyone else. Her grandfather had designed the seal himself. 40 years ago, at a desk in a one-room office in Philadelphia, before Sterling Capital was Sterling Capital, before it was anything except a very stubborn man with a very clear idea and absolutely no interest in being told it wouldn't work. The seal was a compass rose with a single word beneath it, forward. He had explained the choice to Claire when she was 9 years old, sitting beside him at that same desk that now lived in the corner of his office at the Sterling headquarters in Boston. "Why forward?" she had asked. "Because that's the only direction that matters," he said. "You can look back all you want, but you can't go there." She had not understood it fully at 9. She understood it now. Thomas opened the car door. A Sterling Foundation flight coordinator, young woman, efficient burgundy blazer. The practiced calm of someone who arranged logistics for one of the most powerful private investment families in America, met her at the foot of the air stairs. "Miss Sterling," she said. "Not Miss Morgan. Sterling. Everything is prepared. Mr. Sterling boarded 40 minutes ago. He asked me to tell you there's coffee and that he's already annoyed at the financial section of the newspaper and would appreciate your company." Claire almost laughed. Almost. "Tell him I'm on my way," she said. She walked up the stairs and into the aircraft, and at the top of those stairs, she paused for exactly 1 second. Not for drama, not for effect, but because the moment required it, because there are thresholds in a person's life that deserve a breath before you cross them. Then she stepped inside. Richard Arthur Sterling was 81 years old and looked 70, not because he had done anything medical to achieve that, but because he had spent 8 decades being deeply, genuinely interested in everything around him, and curiosity, Claire had decided long ago, must be some kind of preservation. He was seated in the rear section of the cabin, a newspaper folded aggressively on the table in front of him, in the way that newspapers are folded when someone is personally offended by their contents. And when Claire appeared in the doorway, he looked up over his reading glasses with an expression that was equal parts relief and deep affection. "There she is," he said. "Here I am," she said. He stood slowly because he was 81 and the body has opinions at 81 that must be negotiated with rather than ignored, and when she crossed the cabin toward him, he pulled her into a hug that lasted long enough to be real. He smelled like he always had. cedar and paper, and the specific aftershave he had worn since the 1970s and had never seen any reason to change. He held on for a moment, and then he pulled back and held her by the shoulders and looked at her face the way you look at someone when you're checking for the thing they won't say out loud. "You look tired," he said. "I look fine, Grandpa." "You look tired and you look fine. Both can be true." He guided her to the seat across from his and settled back into his own. "Coffee's on the table. Real coffee, not the, what do they call it? Pod coffee." "Whatever it is, it's not coffee. Marcus knows how I take it." He gestured at the small carafe. "He set one up for you, too. Remembered how you take it." Marcus was the Sterling Foundation's senior executive coordinator, a man who had worked for Richard Sterling for 23 years, and who operated with the kind of comprehensive institutional memory that made him, practically speaking, irreplaceable. He remembered how everyone took their coffee. He remembered it correctly. Claire poured herself a cup. She sat back. For a moment, grandfather and granddaughter were quiet together in the particular way of people who have known each other long enough that silence doesn't need to be filled. Then Richard said, "Tell me." "I told you last night. You told me what happened. Tell me how you are." She held the coffee cup between both hands and thought about that question seriously the way it deserved. "I think," she said slowly, "that I spent a long time inside a life that was never quite the right size, and last night I walked out of it. And now I'm sitting here." She paused. "And I'm okay, Grandpa. I genuinely am." He studied her. "You loved him," he said. "Not a question." "I did. And now I understand that loving someone and being right about them are two different things. You can love someone and still be completely wrong about who they are, about who they're going to be." She set her cup down. "I was wrong about Andrew." Richard was quiet for a moment. "I wasn't," he said. She looked at him. He shrugged with the mild, unapologetic candor of a man who has earned the right to honesty by outliving most people's patience for pretense. "I never said anything because you didn't ask, and because it wasn't my life. But I want you to know I was never wrong about what you were walking into." "Why didn't you?" "Because you would have stayed anyway." He said it without cruelty, just plainly. "You loved him, and you needed to find out for yourself. I know how you are, Claire. If I had told you, you would have spent the next 7 years wondering if I was right, and eventually you would have resented me for making you doubt something you wanted to believe. So..." He picked up his own coffee. "I waited." She absorbed that. "That must have been hard," she said. "It was the hardest thing I've done in 20 years, he said simply. "And I once restructured a $140 million portfolio during a market crash in 48 hours, so that is not nothing." She did laugh this time. He smiled into his coffee. The aircraft began to move. The engines climbed in pitch, steady and certain, and outside the windows the tarmac began to slide past as the jet taxied toward the runway, and Claire watched the pre-dawn dark of New Jersey pass the window and thought about all the things she was leaving and all the things she was going toward. The jet lifted. New York fell away beneath them, the city's lights spectacular and indifferent as it always was, as she had always loved it for being. It didn't care who you were. It never had. It was the Whitmores who needed you to be a particular thing in order for you to matter. The city itself had never required it. At 30,000 feet somewhere over Connecticut, Richard Sterling set down his newspaper and said, "Tell me about the Whitmore situation, the actual numbers." And just like that, the conversation shifted, because this was also who they were. Grandfather and granddaughter, yes, but also two people who understood money and strategy and the architecture of power, the way musicians understand sound not as something external, but as a language they thought in. "The merger they're announcing at the gala," Claire said. "The Harrington-Whitmore deal." "What about it?" "It's built on leveraged debt they haven't disclosed publicly. 3 of the Whitmore anchor properties used as collateral are in default risk positions. James Calloway knows about one of them. I'm not sure Andrew knows about any of them." Richard's expression didn't change visibly, but his eyes sharpened, which was his version of a raised eyebrow. "How did you find that?" he said. 7 years inside that house," she said. "People say things when they think you're not really listening, and I was always listening." She wrapped her hands around her coffee again. "I have the documentation. I've had it for 14 months. I was waiting for the right moment to understand what to do with it. And now you understand?" "Now I understand that the right thing isn't to burn it down," she said. "There are 940 employees inside Whitmore Industries. None of them did anything wrong. And there's a man named Daniel Brooks who was fired by Andrew 3 years ago for refusing to sign off on a deal he correctly identified as ethically compromised. He's been consulting independently since then. He's the best operational mind Andrew ever had access to, and Andrew fired him for having a conscience. Richard studied her. "You want to restructure," he said. "I want to remove the people who broke it and hand it to the person who would have protected it," she said. "That's different from revenge. It's also more complicated." "I know. It requires you to be in that room not as an ex-wife with a grievance, but as a principal of Sterling Capital with controlling leverage. It requires you to be in that room as yourself." "I know." He was quiet. The jet hummed. Somewhere toward the front of the aircraft, a crew member moved with the quiet efficiency of someone trained to be present without being noticed. "Your grandmother," Richard said finally, "would have liked to see this." Claire looked at him. His expression had shifted. Not into grief exactly, it was too far past grief for that. More like the particular tenderness that comes after grief when you've made your peace with a loss, but the love itself never goes anywhere. "She always said you were the one who understood," he continued. "Your father understood how to make money. Your uncle understood how to protect it. But she said you understood why it matters. The distinction she was talking about between building something and using it. She said that one was different from the others." He nodded slightly. She was right, as usual. Claire felt something press at the back of her throat. She swallowed it. She would have come into the gala in something completely wrong for the occasion and looked more magnificent than anyone in the room, Claire said. He laughed real warm, the same laugh she had heard on the phone the night before. "Oh, absolutely. She would have worn red. She wore red to everything. She said it was her version of a signature." "It was." "It was." He picked up his newspaper again, folded it differently, settled. "Get some sleep if you can. The gala starts at 7. We land at 2. Marcus has the afternoon arranged. Margot will be at the hotel at 3 to deal with the—" He gestured vaguely at her appearance, not rudely, just the gesture of a man who acknowledges the existence of a category of preparation he has no personal experience with. "Hair and makeup," she said. "That, yes. I know. I'll sleep." She settled back, closed her eyes, then opened them. "Grandpa." "Thank you for waiting." He turned a page of the newspaper. "Thank you for coming back," he said. She closed her eyes, and this time she slept. She slept above the clouds above the city that didn't know yet what the night was going to bring, above the Whitmore estate, where Andrew was probably already on the phone with his PR team, preparing the announcement that would make his family the most powerful name in American real estate for the next decade. She slept above all of it, and woke up as the jet began to descend. The afternoon moved quickly. That was the thing about the afternoon of a day like that. It had its own momentum, its own logic, and all you had to do was not get in the way of it. Marcus had arranged everything with the precision that was his particular art form. The hotel suite was not the one the Sterling Foundation used for board meetings. It was smaller, more private, the kind of suite that exists for the benefit of its occupant, rather than for the impression it makes on guests. Marcus had already had the black gown hung and steamed. The shoes were on the dresser. A light meal was on the table. Margot arrived at 3 exactly, which was also not a surprise. Margot Belloise was 47 years old, had worked in New York fashion and styling for 22 years, and had exactly 2 professional rules. First, never be late, and second, never make a client look like they're trying too hard. She looked at Claire for a long moment when she came in the professional assessment that takes in everything at once, and then she said, "How much time do we have?" 3.5 hours. "Excellent. Sit down. Don't talk unless I ask you something." She began unpacking. "You have magnificent bone structure. I don't know why anyone let you walk around for 7 years, looking like a woman who was apologizing for taking up space, but we're going to fix it tonight." Claire sat down. She thought about telling Margot that she hadn't needed fixing, that the way she had looked for 7 years was also a choice, also deliberate, also part of something. She thought about explaining the strategy behind the smallness, the way you can sometimes move most freely when you're invisible. She didn't say any of that. Instead, she said, "I want to look exactly like myself, not a version of myself, myself." Margot met her eyes in the mirror. "That," she said, "is the easiest request anyone has ever made of me, because you already look like yourself. We just need to stop hiding it." She went to work. By 6:15, Claire was standing in front of the full-length mirror in the suite, and the woman looking back at her was, she didn't have the word for it right away, which was unusual for her. She stood there looking for a moment before she found it. The word was present. Not beautiful, though, she was not powerful, though. That was also true, but specifically and entirely present. There was nothing about the woman in that mirror that was performing or minimizing or apologizing or calculating. She was just there, fully, completely, in a way that she realized with a small jolt she had not been in a very long time. Her phone buzzed. Marcus Carr arrives at 6:30. Mr. Sterling will meet you at the venue. Press line on the east entrance. Foundation rep will be alongside you. You do not need to stop for questions tonight. She texted back, understood. Thank you, Marcus. She put the phone in her evening bag. She took one last look at the mirror. Okay, she said. Same word she had said this morning. Different weight to it now. She walked out. Downstairs, the foundation car was already at the curb. Not a black sedan this time, something with a little more intention behind it, because tonight required intention. The driver held the door without comment, the way excellent drivers do, and she got in, and the car moved into the New York evening traffic heading toward Midtown. In the car, she was quiet. Outside, the city slid past. On any other Tuesday in October, this would be unremarkable. Midtown traffic, evening lights, people on sidewalks going to dinner, going home, going wherever. Their Tuesday evening required them to be. Unremarkable. Ordinary. The city being itself. But something was different in the air tonight, and she felt it not dramatically, not as a premonition exactly, more the way you feel a change in weather pressure before the storm arrives, a kind of tightening, a sense that the world is about to shift on its axis, by a few degrees that won't look like much from a distance, but will change everything about where things land. She breathed. The car turned toward the venue. The American Business Leaders Gala was held annually at a venue in Midtown that had been hosting consequential events for 60 years and had the particular self-assurance of a place that knows its own history. Tonight, the east entrance was lined with press cameras and reporters arranged in the organized chaos of an event where everyone who mattered was expected to arrive within the same 2-hour window, and everyone with a camera wanted to document who walked in with whom and what it meant. The Sterling Foundation's entrance was not announced. It didn't need to be. What happened instead was this. The Foundation's advance team arrived 40 minutes before Claire's car did, and they did the thing that excellent advance teams do, which is make the necessary arrangements quietly and completely, so that when the principal arrives, everything is already in motion. A private arrival lane had been arranged through a contact who had known Richard Sterling since 1987 and owed him several favors that had nothing to do with aviation access routes. The press line was set at a distance. The east entrance was cleared. None of that was the moment anyone noticed. The moment everyone noticed came from above, because 20 minutes before Claire's car arrived, something happened over the venue that nobody had anticipated, and nobody had arranged something that was purely coincidental, but that in the way of things on nights when everything is already charged with significance felt like anything but coincidence. The Gulfstream G700 with the Sterling Foundation seal on its tail, which had circled once over Midtown while waiting for landing clearance at Teterboro, was briefly, clearly, unmistakably visible through a break in the cloud cover above the venue. Someone at the venue, a guest early arrival stepping outside for air, looked up, saw it, recognized the tail seal with the kind of recognition that happens when you've been in the investment world long enough to know what that mark means, said loudly enough for 3 people to hear, "Is that the Sterling jet?" Those 3 people each told 3 people. By the time Claire's car pulled into the arrival lane, the rumor had moved through the venue's lobby like something with a life of its own. Not a rumor, really, a question. 2 words repeated in varying combinations, with varying degrees of disbelief: Sterling Foundation. Sterling Foundation. Sterling. Here. Tonight. Inside the venue in the main reception hall, where the pre-gala cocktail hour was in progress, Andrew Whitmore was standing with a glass of scotch in his hand, and 3 of his father's former associates holding court about the merger announcement, looking exactly like a man who expected this evening to be the best night of his professional life. His PR director, a meticulous woman named Karen Holt, who missed nothing, appeared at his elbow. "Andrew," she said quietly, "I need a minute." "Karen, I'm in the middle of my Andrew." The second time she said his name had a different texture to it. He heard it. He turned. "What?" She leaned in, said something too quietly for the associates to hear. Andrew's face went through 3 expressions in rapid succession: confusion, then dismissal, then something that was not quite sure what to be. "That's not possible," he said. The tail seal was confirmed by 2 different guests with direct Sterling business relationships. "It's not a mistake. Sterling isn't at this event. Sterling hasn't attended a public event in 4 years. I know, that's why people are asking questions." She glanced toward the lobby. "The press line outside is starting to pick it up. Somebody posted a photo of the jet overhead. It's moving." He stared at her. "Why would the Sterling Foundation be at this event tonight?" She looked at him with the careful expression of someone who has a thought she's not certain she should say. "Karen, I don't want to speculate. I'm asking you to." She paused, then very carefully. "The only business interest Sterling Capital has in anything overlapping with tonight's announcement would be through the Harrington side of your merger. Sterling has a silent position in 2 of the Harrington anchor funds. It's not public, but it's not relevant," he said quickly. "That position is minor. It doesn't give them any stake in the—" He stopped. His jaw shifted. "Who authorized the guest list update?" "That's what I came to tell you. There was an update made to the gala's official registration 48 hours ago. 3 new names added under the Sterling Foundation designation. They were processed through the venue's standard registration system. By the time our event coordinator noticed the flag, it had already been confirmed." Andrew was quiet. Around him, the cocktail hour continued. Glasses clinked. Conversations rose and fell. His father's former associates were politely pretending they hadn't noticed his attention had left them. "Who are the 3 names?" he said. Karen handed him her phone. The registration update printed in clean type: Sterling Capital Group. Richard A. Sterling, Principal. Marcus J. Webb, Senior Coordinator. And she watched his face as he reached the 3rd name: C. Sterling Foundation Principal. He read it twice. "C. Sterling," he said. "I don't know who C. Sterling is," Karen said, carefully. "It's not a name in any of our briefing documents. We're trying to identify—" "I need you to find out," he said. His voice had changed. Something had tightened in it. "Right now, I need to know exactly who is walking through that door." Karen took her phone back. She walked quickly toward the lobby. Across the room, Evelyn Whitmore, who had been charming a cluster of society women near the bar with a story about Claire's departure, the small-town girl, the unsigned settlement, the woman who finally went back where she came from, was interrupted by the appearance of her own assistant at her shoulder. The assistant said something. Evelyn's expression did not change visibly, but she set her glass down on the nearest surface without looking for a coaster, which anyone who knew Evelyn Whitmore would tell you was not something she did. Evelyn Whitmore always looked for the coaster. "What did you just say?" Evelyn asked. "The Sterling Foundation," the assistant said. "Richard Sterling is here tonight. He just cleared the east entrance." Evelyn turned toward the lobby, slowly, the way you turn when you're not sure you want to see what's there. The lobby was visible through the main reception hall's glass partition. Through that partition, she could see the crowd that had gathered near the east entrance, the particular magnetic gathering of people who are pretending to be doing something else while absolutely not doing something else. The crowd without seeming like a crowd that forms when something worth watching is about to happen. She watched. The Foundation's advance representatives moved through the lobby first. Marcus Webb, whom she recognized from his reputation, silver-haired, precise, the kind of man who moves through rooms, like rooms exist specifically to be moved through efficiently. 2 security personnel, the Foundation's communications director, then Richard Sterling himself. 81 years old, thin, upright in the particular way of men who were raised to stand as though they meant it and have never stopped. He wore a dark suit that had been made for him by someone who understood that the purpose of good tailoring is to make the clothes irrelevant. He moved slowly and without apology for the slowness. He looked at the room the way men look at rooms when they've been in enough of them to be unimpressed by any single one. Evelyn watched all of this with the controlled attention of a woman calculating something. Sterling Capital, Richard Sterling, here, tonight. The same night Andrew was announcing. She reached for her phone, called her son. It rang 3 times. "Andrew, have you seen—" "I'm looking at the lobby right now, Mother." "Who is C. Sterling, the 3rd name on—" "I don't know. Karen is working on it. We need to know before they reach the main hall. If Sterling Capital has any overlapping interest in the Harrington deal, and they're here tonight to—" "Mother." His voice came through the phone, strained and tight, in a way she recognized the sound of Andrew Whitmore at the edge of composure. "I need you to stay calm." "I am perfectly calm." "You called me across a crowded room instead of walking over, which means you're not. Stay where you are. Let Karen—" He stopped. She heard it, the shift in the background noise on his end. The cocktail hour murmur of a ballroom full of wealthy people who have nothing surprising to react to. That murmur had changed pitch, had changed quality. Something had moved through it. "Andrew," Evelyn said. "Andrew, what is—" But he had already lowered the phone from his ear, because through the glass partition, through the crowd that had gathered and was now parting the way, crowds part, not when they're instructed to, but when they collectively recognize that something is passing through them that requires space. Through all of that, Evelyn saw her. At first, she was simply a woman in a black gown, tall, composed, moving through the parting crowd, the way water moves, not forcing anything, not requiring anything, simply taking the path that presents itself, which in this case was a path that presented itself because everyone in the lobby had stopped moving. Beside her, slightly behind Richard Sterling, Marcus Webb to the left, security at the perimeter. She was not looking at anyone in particular. She was not performing a rival. She was simply walking through a lobby at an event she was attending, and the fact that the entire room had stilled around her was something she appeared entirely indifferent to. Evelyn Whitmore stared. The woman turned her head slightly, taking in the room with the casual survey of someone who has assessed rooms like this one many times before. And for one fraction of a second, her eyes passed over the glass partition and the older woman standing behind it with a phone pressed to her ear and an expression that was beginning very slowly, very unwillingly, to rearrange itself around a truth that Evelyn Whitmore was not yet ready to accept. Their eyes met. Claire's expression did not change. She did not smile. She did not nod. She offered nothing, not acknowledgement, not triumph, not the slightest flicker of the satisfaction she had every right to feel in that moment. She simply looked, and then she looked away and kept walking. In the ballroom. Andrew Whitmore still had the phone pressed to his ear, but he had forgotten about the phone, forgotten about his mother's voice saying his name through the speaker, forgotten about the merger announcement and the press release and the speech he had rehearsed twice yesterday in front of Karen and his communications director. He had forgotten about all of it, because he had seen her, and the word that arrived in his mind, not manufactured, not performed, arriving the way understanding arrives when there is no time to intercept. It was not her name. The word that arrived was wrong. We were wrong. Not me. Not Mother. We. He lowered the phone. His glass of scotch, he became aware of it again, the weight of it in his hand, the way it had grown warm from being held too long. He looked at it as if seeing it for the first time. Then he set it down on a nearby table, and he watched the east entrance. And through the murmuring, shifting, reconfiguring crowd, through all the faces turning, all the recognition rippling outward from person to person, like something dropped into water, he watched the woman he had divorced sign her divorce papers without flinching. 24 hours ago, walk into the room where he was supposed to have the best night of his career. She walked in on the arm of Richard Arthur Sterling, billionaire, founder of Sterling Capital Group, and something Andrew was only now in this moment in front of 200 of the most important people in American business, beginning to understand with a cold and terrible clarity her grandfather. The room did not erupt. That was the thing people would remember afterward, the ones who were there who told the story later at dinner tables and in offices, and in the kind of quiet conversations that happen when two people who both witnessed something need to confirm to each other that they actually saw what they think they saw. They would say it didn't explode, it didn't crash, it went the other direction. It went completely, absolutely silent. 200 people in formal wear holding drinks, mid-sentence, mid-laugh, mid-whatever they had been doing a moment before, and then nothing. A silence that fell over the ballroom, the way a curtain falls fast, complete and final. Claire walked through it. She had Richard's arm lightly in hers, not for support, not for staging, just the natural hold of a granddaughter, walking with her grandfather into a room, the way they had walked into rooms together since she was tall enough to reach his elbow. Marcus Webb followed 3 steps behind his expression, professional and neutral, in the way of a man who had attended many consequential moments and understood that his job in them was to be invisible. She felt the room. She was good at feeling rooms. 7 years of walking into rooms where she was being measured the moment she appeared had given her a kind of sonar, a precise, almost physical awareness of where attention was concentrated, where it was pulling away, where it was pretending to do one thing while doing another. She could feel the 200 pairs of eyes on her like a change in air pressure. She could feel the specific burning concentration of certain eyes more than others. She did not look for Andrew. She did not need to. She already knew exactly where he was. She had seen him through the glass partition from the lobby, registered his position automatically, the way you register a potential hazard, without breaking stride. He was near the center of the room, slightly to the left of the main presentation stage, and he had not moved in the 45 seconds it had taken her to cross from the lobby entrance to the ballroom floor. She knew because she could feel it. The particular fixed quality of the gaze of a man who has just understood that he made a catastrophic error. Richard leaned toward her slightly, his voice very low. "Heads up, 3 o'clock. Holt's PR people are already moving." "I see them," she murmured. "The press at the periphery has cameras up." "I know." "You're doing beautifully," he said. She almost smiled. "You're biased," she said. "Irrelevant," he said. "Still true." They reached the Foundation's designated table. Marcus had arranged this 2 days ago, through the venue coordinator, a round table near the right side of the room, excellent sightlines to the presentation stage, not too central to seem aggressive, not too peripheral to be ignored. The positioning was intentional. Everything Marcus did was intentional. It's why Richard had kept him for 23 years. Claire settled into her chair. And now, only now, with the table between her and the room, with a glass of water in front of her and Richard to her left, and the Foundation's legal director to her right now, she looked. She scanned the room with the calm, unhurried thoroughness of a woman who has nowhere to hide and doesn't need to. She found Evelyn first. Evelyn Whitmore was standing near the bar, which was where Claire had seen her last, through the glass partition, but she had turned to face the room now, and her expression, carefully composed, formidably controlled, was doing something at the edges that it wasn't designed to do. Evelyn had spent 50 years perfecting the art of the unreadable face. She could sit through a board meeting where her family's interests were being actively threatened and look mildly bored. She could absorb social reversals at charity events that would have made lesser performers visibly flinch and respond with a smile so practiced it looked surgical. But the edges of Evelyn's face tonight, right now in this room, were doing something she couldn't entirely control. They were afraid. It was small. Most people in the room wouldn't see it. But Claire saw it, because she had spent 7 years learning Evelyn's face, the way a navigator learns coastline, every feature, every telling deviation, every place where the controlled exterior developed a crack when the pressure inside it became too much. Evelyn was afraid, good Claire thought. Not cruelly, not with satisfaction exactly, but with the clear level recognition that fear in Evelyn Whitmore meant Evelyn Whitmore finally understood something true, and truth, even when it arrived in the form of fear, was better than the alternative. Then she found Andrew. I was exactly where she had known he would be, center left near the stage, but he had moved. He had turned fully to face her direction. I was not pretending to look at something else. He was not performing the casual indifference of a man at an event who has spotted someone he knows and is deciding whether to acknowledge them. He was simply standing there looking at her with both hands at his sides and the expression of a man who is doing the kind of interior arithmetic that changes the values of everything he thought he knew. For a moment, and it was only a moment, it lasted perhaps 3 seconds, which at a black tie gala with 200 witnesses is an eternity, their eyes met. Claire held it. Then she looked away. She reached for her water glass. Beside her, Richard said very quietly, "Good." She took a sip, set the glass down, turned to the Foundation's legal director, a composed woman named Patricia Howell, who had been with Sterling Capital for 11 years and had in that time never visibly rattled. "Patricia, where are we on the documentation?" "Everything is ready," Patricia said, equally quiet, equally composed. "The full financial analysis of the Whitmore-Harrington merger, filing the 3 default risk property assessments, and the independent audit comparison are all formatted and ready for disclosure. The moment you give the word, I can have it in front of the relevant parties within 10 minutes. "Not yet," Claire said. "When?" "After the announcement." She looked at the presentation stage. Let them make the announcement. Let them stand in front of this room and tell 200 of the most important people in American business that this merger is solid. Let them commit to it publicly. She paused. Then we talk. Patricia absorbed this. You want them fully committed before you move, Patricia said. I want them to understand the difference, Claire said, between a negotiation and a reckoning. If I stop it before they speak, it's a negotiation. If I wait, they've made representations to this room that they cannot take back. That changes what happens next. Patricia nodded once. Across the room. Andrew had finally moved. He was walking not toward Claire's table, not directly, but in the particular trajectory of a man who is moving towards something while pretending to be moving past something else. He stopped to speak to someone near the bar, made a gesture that was supposed to look casual. Wasn't. His eyes tracked to Claire's table every 8 seconds. She counted. She had time. Karen Holt, his PR director, appeared at Andrew's shoulder again. Claire could see them from across the room, Karen's tight, controlled expression, Andrew's slightly unfocused one. The rapid exchange of words that had the body language of a conversation where one person is saying things the other person is struggling to process. Whatever Karen was telling him, it was hitting hard. Andrew set his glass down, and this time he walked directly toward Claire's table. No pretense, no casual trajectory. He walked the way a man walks when he has decided that maintaining the performance costs more than dropping it. Richard noticed before Claire said anything. Incoming, Richard said mildly. I know. Do you want me to? No, she said. Stay. Richard settled back into his chair with the particular ease of a man who has been in enough rooms where things were about to happen to know when to be still and let them happen. Andrew reached the table. He stopped at a distance that was outside the intimate zone, but inside the zone where a conversation was clearly intended close enough that this was not a passing acknowledgement far enough that he was buying himself a half-second to compose whatever he was about to say. He looked at Claire. He looked at Richard. He looked back at Claire. Claire, he said. His voice was controlled. She would give him that. Whatever was happening beneath the surface of Andrew Whitmore right now, the surface itself was holding. The years of business dinners and investor calls and public announcements had given him a voice that could be steady when the rest of him wasn't. She knew that about him. She had always known it. Andrew, she said. He stopped, recalibrated. In her peripheral vision, she could see people at the nearest tables pretending not to watch, which meant they were absolutely watching. I didn't know you were going to be here tonight. That was rather the idea, she said. He absorbed that. Mr. Sterling, he said, turning to Richard. Whatever he was feeling, his manners were functioning on automatic. I wasn't aware that Sterling Capital had an interest in tonight's event. Richard looked at Andrew Whitmore with the mild, clear gaze of a man looking at someone he has had opinions about for a very long time. We have interests in a great many things, Richard said pleasantly. That's rather what we do. Andrew looked back at Claire. Is there somewhere we can? No, Claire said. Not unkindly, just clearly. Not tonight, Andrew. Tonight you have an announcement to make. I believe it's scheduled for 8:30. You should prepare. His jaw moved. Claire, what are you doing here? She met his eyes fully. Attending a gala, she said, as myself. And that phrase, as myself, landed between them with the weight of everything. It contained all the years of it, all the rooms and dinners and windows and $2.3 million settlements. It carried all the versions of herself she had folded away and put in drawers so that the space around Andrew Whitmore could remain comfortable for everyone but her. He heard it. She could see him hear it. He stood there for one more moment, looking at the woman he had divorced 48 hours ago, across a table in a hotel ballroom where he was supposed to be celebrating, and then he said very quietly, in a voice that had lost all its training, "Who are you?" She looked at him for a moment. "I'll explain after your announcement," she said. He walked away. The cocktail hour ended at 8 o'clock. The 200 guests moved from the reception to the main ballroom, the formal dinner portion, the portion with the speeches and the toasts and the carefully choreographed revelations of business news too significant to release through a press statement and too strategic to waste on anything less than a room full of people who would amplify it immediately in every direction that mattered. The Sterling Foundation table was in the room. Richard ordered sparkling water and looked at the bread roll basket with the interest of a man who has been told by 3 different doctors to limit his thing. Not from nerves, from focus. She could feel the evening assembling itself around her, the speeches building toward the Whitmore announcement, the energy in the room consolidating into the particular anticipatory tension of an event where the main thing hasn't happened yet, but everyone knows it's coming. Patricia Howell, to her right, had her phone face down on the table. Once, without looking up from her bread roll, she said quietly, "The documents are in 3 formats. Hard copy for the board chair, digital for the disclosure filing, and a summary version for the press contacts we've identified in the room." "Perfect," Claire said. "Timelines are your call." "I know." At 8:22, someone 2 tables away said loudly enough to Carrie, "Is that really Richard Sterling? I haven't seen him at a public event since..." And the rest of it got swallowed by the ambient noise. But the frequency of sideways glances toward the foundation table had been steady all evening. The room was aware of them. The room had been aware of them since the lobby. Good, Claire thought again. Attention was information, and information correctly timed was leverage. At 8:29, the evening's host, a cheerful man from the gala's organizing committee who had the professional bonhomie of someone who had emceed 100 of these events and found a way to seem enthusiastic at all of them, approached the podium. He spoke about the gala's history. He thanked the sponsors. He introduced 2 minor awards. He said the word legacy 4 times in 6 minutes, which was about average for this type of event. And then he said, "It is now my distinct privilege to introduce a man whose family has shaped American real estate for 3 generations. Tonight he brings us news of a partnership that will define the next chapter of that legacy. Ladies and gentlemen, Andrew Whitmore." Applause. Andrew walked to the podium. He looked good. She had to acknowledge that. Whatever was happening inside him, and she knew something was happening. She had seen it in his face at the table. She had heard it in his voice. The exterior was intact. The suit was perfect. The posture was composed. He approached the podium like a man who belonged at it, which in many ways for most of his life he had. He gripped the sides of the podium. He looked at the room. His eyes found Claire's table before they found anything else. She saw it happen, the fractional pause, the micro-adjustment, and then he pulled his gaze away and looked at the assembled audience and said, "Thank you." His voice was steady. She gave him credit for it. He spoke for 6 minutes. It was a good speech, well-structured, confident, hitting the notes that a room like this needed to hear. The history of Whitmore Industries, the vision for the next decade, the strength of the partnership, the numbers, revenue projections, market expansion, the combined portfolio value that the merger would create. He made it sound solid. He made it sound certain. He made it sound like the kind of thing that gets built and lasts. At the foundation table, Patricia Howell turned her phone over once, looked at Claire. Claire shook her head slightly. Not yet. Andrew was building to the close now. She could hear it in the rhythm of the speech, the way the sentences were shortening, the way he was drawing the room in. Around her, the audience was leaning forward almost imperceptibly, that physical response to rhetoric that works the body's involuntary agreement. He said, "The Whitmore-Harrington merger is not simply a business transaction. It is a commitment to stability, to growth, to the kind of partnership that is built on solid foundations." Solid foundations. Claire set her water glass down carefully. Patricia looked at her again. This time Claire nodded. Patricia picked up her phone. Within 4 minutes, the things that needed to reach the people they needed to reach had begun moving. 3 members of the Whitmore Industries board were in the room. All 3 received simultaneously a secure digital file from Sterling Capital's legal division. The file was 31 pages. It contained the independent financial analysis of the Whitmore-Harrington merger, including the 3 properties used as collateral that were in default risk positions, the leveraged debt that had not been disclosed in the public merger filing, and a full comparative audit against the numbers Andrew had just presented from the podium. The board members' phones buzzed. One of them, a gray-haired man named Theodore Park, who had been on the Whitmore board for 9 years and had twice in those 9 years raised concerns about financial transparency that had been overruled by Andrew's father and subsequently dismissed. Theodore Park picked up his phone, read the first page, looked up, looked at the Sterling Foundation table, looked back at his phone. He went very still. Andrew finished his speech. The room applauded. Andrew stepped back from the podium with the expression of a man who has just said the thing he came to say and is allowing himself for this specific 30 seconds to feel the satisfaction of the performance. Then his own phone buzzed. He looked at it. Claire watched his face. She had the angle for it, the foundation table, the sightlines. Marcus had arranged the position she had chosen within the table. She was watching Andrew Whitmore's face at the moment. He read the first line of the message Karen Holt had just forwarded to him, the message she had received from Theodore Park, who had forwarded the Sterling Capital disclosure. His expression did not collapse. She had not expected it to. But something behind his eyes went out, like a light in a room you didn't know was on until it wasn't. A quality of certainty. A fundamental confidence that had been the background of his entire persona for 42 years. The assurance of a man who has always been the most powerful person in any room he entered. That quality flickered and dimmed. He looked up from his phone. He found the foundation table. He found her. And for the second time that evening, across the formal distance of a black-tie gala, with 200 witnesses, their eyes met. But this time it was different. This time Andrew Whitmore knew. He knew who she was. He knew what she had. And he knew that everything he had just said from that podium, every carefully constructed word about solid foundations and stability and commitment, was built on ground that the woman sitting at the Sterling Foundation table could, if she chose, to pull away. Completely. Legally. Publicly. Right now. He left the stage, moved through the room, not toward her table. He was too experienced for that, too practiced, too aware that the room was watching, but toward the corridor near the back exit, the particular route of a man who needs a moment that is not in public. 3 minutes later, his assistant appeared at the foundation table, young male visibly uncomfortable in the way of someone carrying a message he wasn't briefed on. "Miss Sterling," he said. Mr. Whitmore was hoping. "Table or corridor?" Claire said. He blinked. "The corridor," he said. He thought it might be. "Table," she said. "Tell him if he wants to speak to me, he comes to this table, in this room, in front of every person who just heard his announcement." The assistant processed this. He walked back the way he came. At the Sterling Foundation table, Richard Sterling was eating his bread roll. He had made his decision about sodium. "Table or corridor?" he said without looking up. "Table," Claire said. He nodded approvingly. Patricia Howell had her pen out. 2 minutes later, Andrew Whitmore walked back across the ballroom toward the foundation table. He walked with the bearing of a man who has decided that the only remaining move available to him is to walk toward the thing he cannot avoid, and to walk toward it as if it was his idea. He reached the table. He looked at Claire. He looked at Richard. He pulled out the empty chair across from Claire and said, "May I?" Richard gestured at the chair in the manner of a man with excellent manners, who is currently extremely interested in a bread roll. Andrew sat down. For a moment no one spoke. Then Andrew said, "How long?" Claire said, "How long have I known about the debt structure? 14 months. How long have I been Claire Sterling my entire life?" He closed his eyes, opened them. Your name. The whole time your name was... "My name is Claire Elizabeth Sterling. I am the granddaughter of Richard Arthur Sterling and the only designated principal heir of Sterling Capital Group. I lived as Claire Morgan for 4 years before I met you because I wanted to understand what it felt like to exist in the world without the Sterling name attached to everything I did." She kept her voice level, even, the voice of someone recounting facts. "And then I met you. And I believed for a while, I genuinely believed that what was between us was real enough to last, real enough to be worth telling you the truth." I was looking at her with an expression that she still couldn't fully name. It had too many things in it. Shock, guilt, something that wanted to be grief but wasn't sure it had earned the right to be. "Why didn't you—" He stopped, reformulated. "If you had just told me who you were." "That's exactly the problem, Andrew." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "If I had told you who I was, you would have treated me the way you're treating me right now, like someone who matters, and I needed to know if I mattered before you knew." She paused. "You answered that question. Your family answered it. Every dinner and every board meeting and every window I stood at in that house answered it." He looked at the table. He looked at his hands. He said very quietly, "I'm sorry." The words landed. She let them. She didn't immediately speak because these were not words that deserved to be immediately absorbed and immediately responded to. They were words that had taken Andrew Whitmore 42 years and one very catastrophic evening to arrive at, and they deserved at least the respect of a moment's silence. "I know you are," she said. "That's not enough," he said. "I know that." "No," she said. "It's not." He raised his eyes to hers. The merger. The disclosure your team sent to the board. What happens now? Are you going to... I'm not going to destroy Whitmore Industries, she said, because there are 940 people who work there who didn't do anything wrong. And I am not my worst experience, Andrew. I don't want to be. He exhaled. Something in his shoulders released. She watched it happen and felt something she hadn't expected. Not satisfaction at his relief, but something gentler than that. Something closer to pity. Not the condescending kind, the human kind. The kind that recognizes a person in the moment they understand the cost of who they've been and grieves for them a little, even if they cost you something too. But, she said. He looked at her. The board is reviewing the full disclosure right now. Theodore Park has already called an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning. The merger in its current form cannot proceed, not because I'm stopping it, but because the numbers in it are not what you told this room they were tonight. She held his gaze. That's not my doing, Andrew. That's the doing of whoever put those numbers in the filing and hoped no one looked closely. His jaw worked. Who knew? She asked. He was quiet. Andrew, who in your organization knew about the default risk on those 3 properties? Another silence. Then, with the particular reluctant tone of a man who is deciding in real time whether the loyalty he is protecting is worth what it's going to cost him, Calloway, and my CFO, and my mother. The room was still humming around them, the gala continuing the evening's program, moving on to its next speaker, the apparatus of a formal event running its course, because that's what formal events do. They run their course regardless of what is happening at any particular table. But at the foundation table, something had gone very quiet and very specific. Your mother, Claire said. She handles a lot of the... He stopped again. And she could see it happening, the recalibration, the reordering of a story he had been telling himself for years. She manages more of the operational decisions than people know. Than you know, Claire said. He didn't answer, but the answer was in his face. Richard Sterling, who had been quiet for the entirety of this exchange, set down his bread roll and looked at his granddaughter. Claire, he said, not directing her, just being there. She looked at her grandfather. In his face was everything she needed. Not instruction, not strategy, not the legal calculus of what to do next. Just the steady, deep, uncomplicated presence of the person who had known her longest and loved her most truly, and who was right now, in this particular moment, simply witnessing. She looked back at Andrew. I'm going to make you an offer, she said. Not because I owe you one, because 940 people deserve better than what happens when this goes the wrong way. Andrew leaned forward slightly. The offer is this. Sterling Capital restructures the merger, the real version with the actual numbers, with the default risk properties disclosed and properly valued. We bring in a neutral third-party auditor and rebuild the filing from the ground up. Whitmore Industries gets the capital injection it genuinely needs, not the leveraged fiction it tried to present tonight. She paused. But the board appoints a new CEO. Someone who has demonstrated that they make decisions based on what's right rather than what's convenient. Andrew's expression tightened. Who? Daniel Brooks, she said. And there it was. The name hit Andrew Whitmore the way certain names hit when they carry the weight of a specific guilt. Daniel Brooks, the man Andrew had fired 3 years ago in a meeting that lasted 11 minutes for the offense of being right about something Andrew didn't want to hear. He looked at the table. Daniel Brooks, he repeated. I was correct about the Meridian deal. You fired him for it. The Meridian deal subsequently failed in exactly the way he said it would. And Daniel Brooks has spent 3 years consulting independently and building a reputation for exactly the kind of ethical operational leadership that Whitmore Industries is going to need in order to come out of this intact. She let that sit. He's also, and I want you to understand this is relevant, he is someone who genuinely cares about those 940 employees. I've spoken with him. I know how he runs things. Andrew was quiet for a long time. The gala continued around them. Somewhere on the other side of the room, Evelyn Whitmore was standing very still near the bar, watching her son sitting at the Sterling Foundation table, watching the conversation she could not hear, but could read in the posture of everyone involved. She set down her second glass of wine. She began walking toward the table. Andrew saw her coming. For a fraction of a second, something moved across his face that Claire recognized the particular expression of a man who has just in the last 45 minutes fundamentally revised his understanding of the most consequential relationship of his adult life, and is now watching that relationship approach from across a ballroom and is not sure for the first time which direction he is going to face when it arrives. He looked at Claire. She said nothing. He looked at his mother. And in the moment before Evelyn reached the table, before she opened her mouth, before the next thing happened, Andrew Whitmore made a decision. He turned back to Claire. "Daniel Brooks," he said, not a question. "Daniel Brooks," she confirmed. He nodded. Once, Evelyn arrived at the table. She looked at the assembled group, her son, Richard Sterling, the woman she had handed a check for $2.3 million less than 48 hours ago and told to go back where she came from, and she said in the voice she used when she was commanding a room, back to the version of events she preferred, "Andrew, we need to speak privately, now." Andrew looked up at his mother, and he said something that in 30 years of watching him defer to her opinion and reshape his decisions around her comfort and look at her at critical moments to confirm the direction she was pointing, she had never heard him say before. He said, "Sit down, Mother." Evelyn Whitmore stared at her son. He said, "There are things you need to hear, and they're going to be said here, at this table." He looked at Claire. Claire looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at Claire. And the fear that Claire had seen at the edges of Evelyn's face from across the room earlier, that small controlled fear that Evelyn had been working to suppress all evening, it wasn't at the edges anymore. It was everywhere. Because Evelyn Whitmore, for all her 50 years of performance and management and carefully orchestrated influence, had just understood something that the best minds in that room had taken all evening to process. The woman she had told to go back where she came from had never left. She had simply been standing in the right position, waiting. And now she was exactly where she had always been going. Evelyn Whitmore did not sit down immediately. That was the first thing. She stood at the edge of the foundation table for a full 4 seconds, which is a long time to stand at the edge of anything, when 200 people are in the room and the people at the table are watching you do it. And in those 4 seconds, her face went through a recalibration that Claire had never seen from her in 7 years. Evelyn was a woman who moved through social situations, the way a ship moves through water. She displaced things, created a wake, and the surface reformed around her passage, as though she had always been there and always would be. She did not hesitate in doorways. She did not stand at the edges of tables. She sat or she commanded the space she was standing in, and both of those things happened on her terms. But right now, she was standing at the edge of the foundation table, and her son had just told her to sit down, and Claire Sterling was looking at her with an expression that contained absolutely nothing. No triumph, no nervousness, no plea for mercy, no residual fear. And Evelyn understood with the particular horrible clarity of a very intelligent woman confronting a situation she failed to anticipate that she had gotten this wrong. Not small wrong. Catastrophically, structurally, fundamentally wrong. She sat down. Richard Sterling watched her do it and then returned his attention to his water glass with the discretion of a man who understands that some moments belong to other people. For a moment, nobody at the table spoke. The gala continued its orchestrated life around them. A second speaker at the podium, applause, the clink of silverware on fine china, the steady ambient murmur of 200 people at dinner, the world's most expensive background noise. Evelyn looked at Claire. When she spoke, her voice was, and Claire noticed this, marked it, filed it, not the voice she used at board meetings or charity galas or dinner tables where she was performing authority. It was quieter, not soft, just quieter, the voice of a woman speaking from a smaller place than she was accustomed to occupying. "How long have you known," Evelyn said, "about the properties, the debt?" 14 months, Claire said. Evelyn absorbed this. Her jaw moved slightly. "You knew for 14 months and you said nothing." "I was trying to decide what to do with it." "And what you decided was this." Evelyn gestured at the room, at the table, at the evening they were all currently inside. "What I decided was that the right thing and the easiest thing were different, and I was going to do the right thing regardless of what it cost me." Claire paused. "It took me a while to get there." Andrew, to Evelyn's left, had not looked at his mother since she sat down. He was looking at the table. In the past 45 minutes, something had happened to Andrew Whitmore's face that Claire couldn't describe precisely, except to say that it had lost a layer of something, not composure, not exactly, but the specific veneer of a man who has always understood himself to be the architect of whatever room he was standing in. That understanding was gone. What was left underneath was something rawer and paradoxically more real. Evelyn said, "You came here tonight to humiliate this family." "No," Claire said. "Then what do you call—" "I call it accountability." Claire's voice didn't rise. It never rose. She had learned a long time ago that the most powerful thing a voice can do in a tense room is stay exactly the same. "I call it the difference between destroying something and correcting it. I could have sent the disclosure to the SEC 3 months ago. I could have sent it to every financial press outlet in the country last week. I could have walked into this room tonight and waited for the announcement and then stood up in front of 200 people and dismantled every word Andrew said from that podium with documentation." She looked at Evelyn steadily. "I did none of those things. I came to this table. I spoke to your son privately. I made an offer." "An offer," Evelyn repeated, and the word in her mouth had a particular texture, not quite contempt, because the contempt was running low on fuel. Something that wanted to be contempt, but was arriving too late to be credible. "A restructured merger with accurate numbers, a third-party audit, and a new operational leadership. Sterling Capital provides the capital injection. Whitmore Industries survives. 940 employees keep their jobs." Claire folded her hands on the table. "That's the offer." "And Daniel Brooks," Andrew said. He said it to the table, not to anyone in particular. Evelyn turned to her son. "What about Daniel Brooks?" Andrew looked at his mother. "He said, 'I fired him because you told me the Meridian deal was solid, and I believed you.'" The silence that followed that sentence was a different kind of silence than any that had come before it at the table. It was the silence of a son saying something to a mother that he had known for 3 years and had never said, and the mother hearing it and knowing that the context in which it was being said meant she could not dismiss it the way she had dismissed every other version of this truth when it arrived through softer channels. Evelyn said, "Andrew." "I was right," Andrew said. "He told me the deal was structured on projections that couldn't hold. He put it in writing. You told me he was being obstructionist. I chose your read over his." He stopped. Then quietly, "Meridian collapsed 8 months later, exactly the way he said it would." "That was—" "Evelyn." Richard Sterling's voice entered the conversation for the first time since Evelyn sat down. It was not loud. It was not aggressive. It was simply the voice of a man who has been in rooms like this one before and knows exactly how much space a true thing requires when it is finally spoken. "Let the boy finish." Evelyn looked at Richard Sterling. Richard Sterling looked back at her with the mild, implacable gaze of a man who has been building things since before Evelyn Whitmore learned how to run hers. She closed her mouth. Andrew said, "I need you to tell me about the 3 properties." Evelyn's expression tightened. "Andrew, this is not the time. The Kearney Avenue portfolio, the Harrington South Fund anchor, and the Delaware Trust collateral," he said, each one slowly, like he was reading from a document which he was from memory, from the 31 pages that had arrived on his phone 40 minutes ago. "Tell me how long those positions have been in default risk." Evelyn said nothing. "Mother." Still nothing. Patricia Howell at Claire's right did not move, did not speak. She sat with the professional stillness of a woman who understood that her role in this specific moment was to be the person with the documentation and let the documentation do its work. Andrew said, "James Calloway knew. You knew. Were there others?" Evelyn looked at her son for a long moment, and then something happened to her face that Claire had never in 7 years seen happen. Evelyn Whitmore, in the middle of the American Business Leaders Gala, at a table where her son's ex-wife and the founder of Sterling Capital were both watching, looked for just a moment, just briefly, like an old woman who was very tired. Not defeated, not broken. Evelyn was not the kind of person who broke cleanly, but tired. The specific exhaustion of a person who has been holding something up for a very long time and has just been asked in a room full of people to put it down. "I was protecting the family," she said. "From what from," she stopped. "From exactly this. From a moment exactly like this one." She gestured at the table, at the room, at everything. "Everything I did was to protect what your grandfather built, what your father maintained, what I spent 50 years ensuring would continue." "You hid a financial disaster inside a merger filing," Andrew said. "That's not protection. That's fraud." The word landed on the table like something heavy. Everyone at the table heard it. Evelyn heard it. She sat very straight. Don't use that word. It's the correct word. Andrew. Patricia. Andrew looked at Patricia Howell. The board disclosure that was sent tonight, the full documentation. Can you walk us through the relevant legal exposure? Patricia looked at Claire. Claire nodded. Patricia opened the file on her tablet. What followed was 12 minutes of conversation that Claire had known in the abstract was coming, but that still had a weight to it that she hadn't fully prepared for. Not because the information was surprising, she had read it, cataloged it, understood its implications months ago, but because of the people at the table, because of Andrew's face as he listened to a legal summary of decisions his mother had made inside his own company without his knowledge, because of the way Evelyn sat through each item with the increasingly rigid posture of a woman who is refusing to flinch and finding it costs more with every minute. The Kearney Avenue portfolio had been in default risk status for 22 months. It had been concealed from the board through a series of reclassified accounting entries approved by the CFO and reviewed and signed off on by James Calloway. The Harrington South anchor position had been flagged internally 11 months ago by a mid-level analyst whose report had been, and Patricia said this word carefully, filed without further action. The Delaware Trust collateral had been pledged without formal board authorization. Patricia closed the tablet. Andrew said nothing for 30 seconds. Then he said, "How did you find all of this?" He was asking Claire. She said, "A mid-level analyst named Renata Voss. She sent her report to 3 people when it was filed without action. 2 of those people deleted it. The third kept a copy." She paused. "I found the third person." Andrew stared at her. "How long ago?" "I told you, 14 months. You found a whistleblower inside my company 14 months ago, and what did you do?" "I protected her. I made sure she had proper legal representation. I made sure she understood her options. And I waited." Claire looked at him steadily. "Because I was still your wife 14 months ago, Andrew, and I was trying to figure out whether there was a version of this that didn't destroy everything." The weight of that sentence settled over the table. Evelyn, who had been maintaining her rigid composure through the entire financial summary, said, "You were protecting an informant against our family while living in our house." "I was protecting a woman who did the right thing and was punished for it," Claire said. "And yes, while doing that, I was living in your house, attending your dinners, standing at your windows, being told on a fairly regular basis that I wasn't quite good enough to be there." She paused. "It was an interesting combination of experiences." Andrew put his hands over his face. It was the most unguarded gesture she had ever seen from him. He sat there for a moment with his hands covering his face and his elbows on the table at a formal gala, and he breathed, and nobody at the table said anything. Richard Sterling looked at his granddaughter. She looked back at him. He gave the smallest nod, just barely. She understood. Andrew lowered his hands. His eyes were dry. Whatever he was feeling was staying inside him, which was, Claire thought, probably the right decision for the middle of a gala. He said, "What happens to Renata Voss?" Claire said, "She's been offered a position with Sterling Capital's compliance division. She accepted last week." He processed that. "You were already moving," he said. "Not accusatory, just registering." "Yes." "For how long have you been—" He stopped. Started again. "How much of the last 14 months was planned?" "Not planned," she said. "Prepared. There's a difference. I didn't know what I was going to do until about 6 months ago, when I finally understood that the right thing and the thing that would be easiest for me were completely incompatible, and I had to choose." She folded her hands on the table again. "I chose the right thing, which meant coming back as myself, which meant tonight." Evelyn, who had been quiet since the word fraud, spoke. Her voice had changed again. Not softer exactly, but differently calibrated. The voice of a woman who is making a series of rapid private calculations and has arrived at a decision she is going to deliver as if it was always her intention. "What do you need from me?" she said. Everyone at the table looked at her. It was Andrew who spoke first. "Mother." "I'm asking Claire," Evelyn said. Claire looked at Evelyn Whitmore. In all the years she had known this woman, all the dinners and the windows and the charity galas and the board meetings and the small, precise cruelties delivered with perfect deniability, she had never once heard Evelyn ask anyone what they needed. Evelyn told people what they would do. Evelyn informed people of the situation and explained to them their role within it. What Evelyn did not do was sit at a table at a gala and ask someone what they needed, but she was doing it now. And Claire, looking at her, understood something that surprised her. Evelyn wasn't performing it. She was genuinely asking. Because Evelyn Whitmore, underneath the 50 years of performance and the portraits and the chandeliers and the practiced contempt, was also a woman who loved something, not the family name exactly, not the money exactly, but something underneath both of those things. Something that the family name and the money had been in her mind protecting all along. She had protected it badly. She had protected it through methods that were wrong and that had cost real people real things, and that had now resulted in her sitting at a table across from the woman she had underestimated most profoundly of her professional life, asking what was needed. But the love itself, Claire could see it. Underneath all of it. Complicated and compromised and responsible for genuine harm, but there. She said, "I need you to cooperate fully with the board review. Every document, every communication, everything related to the 3 properties and the Harrington filing." She paused. "I need you to do that voluntarily before they ask which will happen tomorrow morning." Evelyn's jaw tightened. "And if I do?" "Then the board has the option of handling this as a corporate restructuring matter rather than a regulatory disclosure event." Claire held her gaze. "I'm not promising outcomes I don't control. I'm telling you that voluntary cooperation changes what the board can do. It doesn't guarantee what they will do." "That's honest," Evelyn said. "I told you once," Claire said, "that the $2.3 million wasn't accurate. I was talking about worth. I'm still talking about worth. Your family's worth, the real kind, not the portfolio kind, is still something that can be protected if the people in it stop protecting the wrong things." Evelyn looked at her for a long moment. Then she did something that Claire had never seen from her. She looked at her son, not to manage him, not to check whether he was holding the correct position or providing the correct expression for the room. Just looked at him, the way a mother looks at a son when the scaffolding of everything else has come down and there's just the 2 of them and the question of what they are to each other when none of the rest of it matters. Andrew met his mother's eyes. Something passed between them that was private and specific, and not for anyone else at the table. Then Evelyn said, "I'll cooperate." The rest of the evening moved with the particular speed of things that have been decided and are now simply being implemented. Patricia Howell made 3 calls from the corridor between 8:55 and 9:15. The Foundation's legal team, who had been on standby since 7 o'clock, began preparing the preliminary restructuring documents. Theodore Park, who had spent the dinner hour in a state of controlled agitation, arrived at the Foundation table at 9:20 and shook Richard Sterling's hand with the expression of a man who has spent 9 years on a board, wishing someone would do exactly what was being done tonight. "Richard," Theodore said, "it's been a long time." "Theodore," Richard said with genuine warmth, "you kept the copy." Theodore glanced at Claire. "Renata Voss came to me first, actually, before she sent the report anywhere else. I told her to keep a copy." He looked slightly abashed. "I wasn't brave enough to do more than that at the time." "You did what you could when you could," Claire said. "That's how most things work." Theodore nodded. He had the look of a man for whom that specific absolution meant something real. He sat down with them, and the 4 of them, Claire, Richard, Theodore, Patricia, began the actual work. Not the gala work. Not the performance of the evening, but the real structural work of dismantling something that had been built wrong and rebuilding it correctly. The conversation was technical and fast and specific, and for an hour it sounded like any corporate restructuring discussion, except for the fact that it was happening at a round table in a ballroom while dessert was being served 20 feet away. Andrew remained at the table for the first 40 minutes of this. He sat and listened and occasionally asked questions that were genuinely useful. He was not, and had never been, unintelligent. He had made bad choices and deferred to wrong people and failed to look closely enough at things he should have looked at. But he was not stupid, and in this hour he was applying his genuine intelligence to a situation with the focus of a man who understands that the only remaining avenue available to him is to be useful. At 9:55 he said, "I should call Daniel." Everyone looked at him. "Daniel Brooks," he said. "I should call him tonight, before any of this becomes public. He deserves to hear it from me first." He paused. "I owe him that much." Claire looked at him. And this was, she marked it because it was real, the moment that Andrew Whitmore most clearly became someone she had once loved. Not because he was calling Daniel Brooks, but because he identified the right thing to do unsolicited and stated his intention to do it because the man deserved it. Not because it was strategically optimal, not because it looked good, because it was owed. "Yes," she said. "Call him." Andrew pushed back from the table. He stood. He looked at Claire, and in his look there was not a request, not an apology, not an appeal, just a person looking at another person with all the armor down, the way you rarely get to see people look, and almost never get to see people who have been as protected as Andrew Whitmore let themselves look. "Thank you," he said. She said, "Don't thank me, do better." He nodded. He walked away from the table and toward the corridor, his phone in his hand. Evelyn had left 40 minutes earlier, not fleeing, not dramatically, but with the particular exit of a woman who understands she has said the things she needed to say, and that the work that remains is not hers to participate in tonight. She had touched Andrew briefly on the shoulder, in passing the most unguarded physical gesture Claire had ever seen from her fingers on her son's shoulder for half a second there, and gone, and walked toward the exit, with her back straight and her face composed, and only the eyes showing the thing underneath that composure that was still and always going to be there. At 11 o'clock the gala officially concluded. The room began to empty, coats were collected, cars were called. The apparatus of a formal evening dismantling itself into the night, all the consequential conversations that had happened in this room settling into the broader record of things that happened tonight that would matter in ways people were still calculating. Richard said, "You should eat something." Claire looked at the untouched dessert plate in front of her. "Chocolate something." She picked up the fork. Richard said, "Patricia, good work tonight." Patricia said, "Thank you, sir. I'll have the preliminary restructuring framework drafted by morning." "Take the night," he said. "Draft it in the morning when you've slept." She looked mildly startled in the way of someone for whom being told to sleep is not standard operating procedure. "Sir, the morning," he said. "It will still need doing in the morning." Patricia gathered her things, said goodnight, left. Marcus appeared at Richard's shoulder. He had been circulating at the perimeter of the evening with the uncanny efficiency of a man who tracks a room without appearing to track anything. "Car is outside whenever you're ready, sir." 5 minutes, Richard said. Marcus nodded and retreated. Richard looked at his granddaughter. She was eating the chocolate something. It was, she decided, actually quite good. One of those small, absurd details that attach themselves to significant evenings, the way you remember exactly what the air smelled like, or what the last thing you ate tasted like, at a moment that changed something. "How do you feel?" he said. She thought about it seriously. "Strange," she said. "Not bad, just strange." She set the fork down. "I spent so long imagining what tonight would be like. I had versions of it in my head, the way it would go, what people would say, how it would feel. And none of the versions were this. This was quieter, and harder, and more human." She looked at the empty chairs where Andrew and Evelyn had been sitting. "I kept expecting to feel something triumphant. I don't. I feel like something got set right, which is different." Richard said, "It is different. Is that good?" "It's better," he said. "Triumph is about you. Setting things right is about the thing." She absorbed that. The room was nearly empty now. Staff were moving through, collecting glasses, resetting the spaces. The chandelier above the main hall was still blazing, but it had lost the charged quality of a room full of intention and was just light now, just a very expensive light in a very large room at the end of an evening. "Grandpa," she said. Do you think he'll actually call Daniel tonight?" Richard considered this genuinely. "Yes," he said. "I think he will." "Why?" "Because the people who surprise you, the ones who do the thing you thought they were too far gone to do, they usually do it when it's too late for it to benefit them, when the only reason to do it is that it's right." He picked up his water glass. Andrew Whitmore lost everything tonight that he thought he valued, and the first thing he did was figure out who he owed an apology to. That's not nothing. "No," she said, "it's not nothing. It's also not enough," he said, because he was Richard Sterling, and he was not sentimental about incomplete things. "But it's a start." She looked at him. He put down the water glass and pushed back from the chair slowly, with the careful negotiation of 81 years making its argument. "Come," he said. "The car is waiting. You've done enough for one evening." She stood. They walked through the emptying ballroom together, grandfather and granddaughter, the long way around past the tables and the dying candlelight, and the last staff member straightening chairs at the edges of the room. At the doorway, Claire stopped. She turned back and looked at the room one more time. Not to memorize it, not for sentiment, just she looked. The place where the evening had happened, where Andrew had spoken from the podium about solid foundations, where Evelyn had asked for the first time what was needed, where Theodore Park had shaken Richard's hand, where Andrew had walked away toward a corridor to make a phone call he owed to a man he had treated badly and done it because it was right and not for any other reason. She looked at all of it. Then she turned away and walked out into the October night. Behind her, the building continued its process of becoming what all significant buildings become at the end of significant evenings, just a building, just walls and light. The significance was finished with it. The significance had walked out the door. Thomas had the car warm. Marcus was already in the front passenger seat, his tablet out, his expression calm and organized. Richard got in slowly and with dignity. Claire followed. The car pulled away from the curb. New York moved past the windows. She did not look back at the venue. She had seen it. She was done with it. And something that had been held tightly in her chest for 14 months through the discovery, and the analysis, and the decision-making, and the divorce, and the one suitcase, and the hotel room, and the pre-dawn tarmac, and the jet, and the garment bag, and Margot, and the lobby, and the ballroom, and the table, and Andrew's face, and Evelyn's question. Something that had been held very tightly for a very long time. Finally, in the back seat of a car, heading through Midtown Manhattan on a Tuesday night in October, let go. She breathed. Richard beside her said nothing. He reached over and briefly, gently covered her hand with his. She looked at his hand over hers, old, steady, entirely certain. She turned her hand over and held on. The city moved past. The car drove north, and somewhere across town in a hotel corridor outside an emptying ballroom. Andrew Whitmore stood with his back against the wall and his phone pressed to his ear, listening to it ring, waiting for the man he had wronged to answer. The phone rang, and then a voice. "Daniel Brooks." Andrew closed his eyes. "Daniel," he said, "it's Andrew Whitmore. I know it's late. I know." He stopped, swallowed, started again. "I need to say something to you that should have been said 3 years ago, and I'm sorry it's taken this long." On the other end of the line, a pause. Then, "I'm listening." And Andrew Whitmore in the corridor outside the room where his family name had almost come apart at the seams told the truth. The call between Andrew and Daniel Brooks lasted 47 minutes. Claire didn't know that detail until 3 days later, when Daniel told her himself, sitting across from her in the Sterling Capitol conference room in Boston, with a cup of coffee going cold between his hands, and the expression of a man who is still in the process of adjusting to a reality that arrived faster than he had any framework to prepare for. 47 minutes, he said. "I timed it. I don't know why I timed it. Habit, maybe. I time things." He turned the coffee cup slightly. He cried, not a lot, but at the beginning when he first said he was sorry, not the polished sorry, the real one, he cried. Claire said, "Did you believe him?" Daniel thought about that seriously. He was the kind of man who thought about things seriously, which was part of why Andrew had hired him 11 years ago, and part of why Andrew had fired him 3 years ago, and all of why Claire had sought him out 6 months before tonight. "Yes," Daniel said. "I believed him, not because it changes what he did, but because the man I heard on that phone call at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, standing in a hotel corridor after everything had just fallen apart, that man wasn't performing an apology. He was delivering one." He looked at her. People who are performing apologies don't call at 11:30. They call at 10 in the morning when they've had time to prepare. Claire said, "Will you take the position?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "You already know I will." She said, "I wanted to hear you say it." He picked up his coffee. "I'll take it. Not for Andrew. Not even for you if I'm being precise about it. I'll take it, because 940 people showed up to work every day, inside a structure that was making bad decisions at the top, and they did their jobs well anyway, and they deserve leadership that's going to make decisions worth showing up for." He took a sip, made the face of a man encountering cold coffee and continuing to drink it anyway, because the conversation is more important. And because I've spent 3 years consulting independently and doing good work and being entirely right about everything, and it turns out being entirely right in private is a lot less satisfying than I anticipated. She smiled. He smiled back. It was the beginning of something, a professional relationship, a mutual respect, a partnership between two people who had both in their different ways spent years inside a world that required them to be less than they were and had emerged from it clearer about who they intended to be. It was the kind of beginning that announces itself quietly and means more than the loud ones. 3 days after the gala, 3 days after the board emergency meeting that Theodore Park had convened at 7 in the morning in a conference room that smelled like fresh coffee and institutional anxiety. 3 days after Evelyn Whitmore had walked into that meeting with a stack of documents and the particular posture of a woman delivering herself to a process she had designed and was now going to submit to the financial press, had the story. Not the story Evelyn and James Calloway had written, the real one. The Sterling Capital disclosure, as it was already being called, had moved through the relevant circles with the speed of something that has been building pressure for a long time and finally finds its release point. The merger in its presented form was suspended pending restructuring. The board had voted unanimously to appoint an interim executive committee pending the formal installation of new leadership. James Calloway had retained his own attorney. The CFO had issued a statement through a publicist that said very little with great precision. The press predictably had a great deal to say. Claire read the coverage from her office in the Sterling Capital building in Boston, the office that had been hers on paper for 3 years, and that she was now inhabiting fully, for the first time the way you inhabit a space differently when you've stopped apologizing for being in it. It was a good office. It had a window that looked out over the city, and she stood at it the first morning without any of the feeling she had stood at the Whitmore windows with. No performance, no goodbye. Just a woman looking at a city she was in that she belonged to that had no opinion about her worth because cities don't have opinions. She liked that. Marcus brought her the morning briefing at 8:15. The journal ran at front page below the fold, he said, setting the physical paper on her desk, with the efficiency of a man who has delivered briefings for 23 years and has the ritual down. The Times ran it in the business section above the fold. Bloomberg has the most complete version of the financial details. There are 6 television requests. I've declined them all pending your instruction. Keep declining, she said. There are also 14 personal messages, 3 from board members at other companies, all context no ask, 2 from previous Sterling Capital investment partners, 1 from Renata Voss. She looked up. What does Renata say? Marcus paused with this particular pause of a man reading something he has already read and is taking a moment to deliver correctly. She says, I just wanted to say thank you. Not for the job, although thank you for that too. For believing that doing the right thing was worth something. I wasn't sure anyone else thought so. Claire held that for a moment. Send her a reply from me, she said. Tell her it was always worth something. Tell her the job starts whenever she's ready. Yes, Miss Sterling. He turned to go. Marcus. He turned back. The other 8 messages. He looked mildly uncomfortable in the way of a person who is choosing between professional discretion and giving a full briefing and has decided correctly that the full briefing is his actual job. 7 are press. 1 is from Andrew Whitmore. She said, What does Andrew say? Marcus said, He says I spoke with Daniel last night. He starts in 3 weeks. I don't know if this is appropriate to say, but I hope whatever comes next for you is everything it should have been all along. She looked at the window. Outside, the city went about its October morning. She thought about Andrew standing in a hotel corridor at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, crying the real cry and meaning the real apology. She thought about Evelyn touching her son's shoulder for half a second in a ballroom, fingers there gone. She thought about a man named Daniel Brooks, who timed a 47-minute phone call because he timed things, which was also the same quality that had made him identify a failing deal correctly 3 years ago and put it in writing and deliver it to a man who wasn't ready to hear it. She thought about all of it. She said, Reply to Andrew. Tell him I hope the same for him. Marcus nodded, left. She sat at her desk. She opened her email. She had 1,742 unread messages, a number that reflected 3 years of a managed absence, the correspondence of a principal who was present on paper and in strategy, but not yet present in the daily life of the company. That was changing now, starting today, starting with the inbox and the briefings and the meetings that Marcus had arranged and the decisions that needed to be made and the work that had been waiting. The work. She had missed it. Not the performance of it, not the board meeting version or the gala version or the version where the point was to be seen doing it. The actual work, the analysis and the judgment and the reading of numbers and situations and people, the particular pleasure of understanding something complicated and knowing what to do about it. She had been doing versions of that work in private for years, the 14 months, with the Whitmore documents, the 6 months of preparation, the 3 years of running the Foundation's portfolio at a distance, but she had been doing it alone in the margins, in the space between the life she was performing and the life she actually had. Now the margin was the page. She opened the first email. It was from the Foundation's senior analyst, a 29-year-old named James Park, who had the particular quality of a person who is very good at something and has not yet entirely realized how good they are, which is the most useful stage of good to be in because the person is still learning without the weight of reputation making them careful. He had sent a preliminary analysis of 2 potential acquisition targets in the infrastructure sector. The analysis was thorough, well-structured, and arrived at the wrong conclusion through completely correct reasoning, which was, in Claire's experience, the most instructive kind of wrong. She drafted a reply, not corrections questions, 7 specific questions about the data points where his reasoning was sound and his interpretation of those data points had drifted. She had learned this from Richard. The questions mattered more than the answers, because the questions taught people to see, and people who could see were more valuable than people who had been told what to look at. She sent the reply, picked up the next email. At 10:15 her phone rang. Not Marcus, not a Foundation number, a personal number she hadn't heard from in 11 years. She looked at the screen. She answered. Elena, she said. Elena Varga had been Claire's closest friend before Claire Morgan existed, before the quiet years, before the identity shift, before all of it. They had met in graduate school, shared an apartment in Philadelphia for 2 years, and maintained the particular friendship of 2 people who are busy and ambitious and not very good at the maintenance rituals of friendship, but who have, when they talk, exactly the conversation they need to have, as if no time has passed. Elena said, I saw the papers. I assumed. I have 14,000 questions. I assumed that too. I'm going to ask all of them. I know. A pause. Then Elena said in a voice that had lost all its news cycle energy and become just a person who knew another person well. Are you okay? Claire said. Yes. Really. Really. She leaned back in her chair. Elena, I feel like myself for the first time in a very long time. That's the truest thing I can say. Good, Elena said with the decisive warmth of a woman who had been waiting to hear that specific sentence for longer than either of them had said out loud. Then we need to have dinner, soon, before you become so powerful and important that you need an appointment to see your own friends. I was always powerful and important, Claire said. I was just quiet about it. Elena laughed, the laugh of someone who has missed a specific laugh for years and is relieved to hear it again. Yeah, she said, you really were. I just didn't know why. A beat. Did it work? Everything you were trying to do, did it work the way you needed it to? Claire thought about that. She thought about the board meeting, about Daniel in the conference room with his cold coffee, about Renata Voss and the message Marcus had read, about Theodore Park shaking Richard's hand, about Andrew in a hotel corridor telling the truth. She thought about the 940 people who would go to work next Monday under leadership that had been chosen because of its conscience rather than its convenience. She thought about her grandfather's hand over hers in the back of a car moving through the October night. She said, it worked better than I planned and differently than I imagined, which I think means it worked the right way. Elena said, I'm so glad. They made a plan for dinner. A real plan with a date and a restaurant, not the kind of plan that exists to be postponed. Claire hung up and sat for a moment with the phone on the desk, and the city outside the window, and the 1,742 emails, and the cold coffee of her own, because somewhere in the morning Marcus had placed a cup on the desk, and she had let it go cold, which was apparently something she did, and which was entirely fine. She was allowed to be a person who let her coffee go cold. She picked it up and drank it cold. At noon, Richard appeared in her office doorway. He did this sometimes appeared in the doorways of rooms she was in, without announcement, the way people move through spaces they are entirely at home in. He was wearing a different suit than yesterday, and the same reading glasses, and the same expression of mild engagement with the world that was his resting state. Board call in 20 minutes, he said. I know. Patricia has the restructuring framework ready. It's good work. I know. I read it at 6 this morning. He nodded, then not moving from the doorway. There's a reporter outside, building lobby. She's been there since 9. Claire looked at him. Which outlet? The Journal. Young woman. Early 30s. She hasn't called the office, hasn't sent a request. She's just there. What's she doing? Reading a book, Richard said, which I find encouraging. A reporter who reads books while she waits is probably a reporter who writes the kind of story worth being in. Claire considered this. What's the book? Richard produced a small folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket, the kind of note that Marcus wrote things on in actual handwriting, because Richard had always preferred actual handwriting. He read, "A Biography of Frances Perkins, First Female Cabinet Secretary, United States, 1933. Claire was quiet for a moment. She said, "Send her up." Richard smiled. Not the large smile of a man who is surprised. The specific, satisfied smile of a man who predicted exactly this and has been proved correct. He disappeared from the doorway. The reporter's name was Sarah Chen. She was 31 years old, had been at the Journal for 6 years, and had Claire established this in the first 2 minutes of the conversation, the best quality a reporter can have, which is that she was more interested in understanding than in confirming what she already thought. She asked questions that came from genuine curiosity rather than from the direction she wanted the answers to go. She sat across from Claire in the conference room adjacent to the office neutral ground, not Claire's desk, not the full CEO staging, and she said, "Miss Sterling, the story that everyone is writing right now is about the disclosure and the merger and the legal situation with Whitmore Industries. That's an important story. But I think there's another story and I'm not sure anyone is seeing it yet." Claire said, "What story is that?" Sarah Chen said, "I think it's about why someone who had access to all of this, the resources, the legal standing, the documentation, spent 14 months deciding what to do with it. Most people in your position would have moved faster or moved harder. You did neither." She looked at Claire directly. "I want to understand why." Claire held the young reporter's gaze. She thought about the answer to that question. She thought about the 14 months. About sitting in the Whitmore house with the knowledge of what she knew and the question of what to do with it, pressing against her every day like a hand against a door she wasn't sure she should open. About the nights she had argued with herself, the version of herself that said, "Burn it down, they deserve it," versus the version that said, "Doing the right thing isn't about what they deserve, it's about who you are." She thought about the version that won. She said, "Because what you do with power, how you use it when you use it, why that's the most important question there is. And I didn't want to answer that question wrong just because the wrong answer was faster." Sarah Chen wrote that down, actually wrote it in a notebook with a pen. "Can I ask something personal?" Sarah said. "You can ask." "Did you love him, Andrew Whitmore? Did you actually love him, or was the whole thing—" "Yes," Claire said. "I loved him. That's not complicated. The complicated part is that loving someone and being right about them are two different things, and I learned that the hard way over 7 years." She paused. "Love is not the same as being safe. I confused those for a long time." Sarah Chen looked at her for a moment. "That's the story," Sarah said quietly. Not to Claire exactly, to herself. The specific private recognition of a person who has found the thing they came looking for. "Write it accurately," Claire said. "I will," Sarah said. She did. The piece ran 4 days later in the Sunday edition, 1,100 words front of the business section. The headline was, "The Woman Who Waited." The subheading was, "How Claire Sterling's Patience Reshaped an Empire and What It Says About Power." It was read by a significant number of people. It was shared widely. It generated over the following week more than 2,000 responses, letters, emails, messages sent through the Journal's website by readers who did not in most cases have anything to do with finance or mergers or corporate restructuring, but who had something to say about a woman who had been told she was worth less than she was and had spent 14 months deciding what the right thing to do was and then done it. Many of the letters were from women over 50 who had been told similar things in their own rooms, their own houses, their own dinner tables, who had been handed their version of the $2.3 million settlement, the summary of what someone else had decided they were worth, and had been expected to take it without argument. Some of them had taken it. Some of them hadn't. All of them wrote as though the story was also about them, because it was. That was the part Claire hadn't anticipated, or hadn't fully anticipated, though Richard, when she mentioned it, said he had expected it entirely. "That's what happens," he said, "when someone tells the truth about something people recognized but didn't have words for. The words travel." "I didn't set out to—" "No," he said. "The people who set out to do it usually don't. The people who do it accidentally are usually just trying to handle their own situation correctly. The effect is the same. They were in his office, the one with the desk where she had sat as a 9-year-old and asked about the compass rose. The desk was still there. The compass rose was still there. Forward, it said. She looked at it. "Grandpa," she said. I need to go to Philadelphia." He looked up. A pause. He understood. "Your grandmother's grave," he said. "I want to tell her how it went." He was quiet for a moment. "She already knows," he said. "But go anyway. She'd want to hear it from you." Claire flew to Philadelphia on a Thursday morning. Not on the G700 on a regular commercial flight, because some trips don't require the weight of the Sterling Foundation, and some mornings are just yours. She took a window seat. She read nothing. She looked out at the clouds for an hour and thought about nothing in particular and everything at once and let the flight be exactly what it was. At the cemetery, she stood for a while. Margaret Ann Sterling née Calloway had died 11 years ago, 2 months after Claire had begun the quiet years, and Claire had attended the funeral as a private individual, not as a Sterling, not as someone the other mourners connected to the family, just as a woman who came to say goodbye to someone she had loved. Nobody had known who she was. She had stood at the back and let her grief be her own, which Margaret would have understood completely. Margaret had taught her to read on a porch in the summers. She had taught her that a woman's intelligence is not an inconvenience to be managed by the people around her. She had worn red to everything. She had believed with the uncomplicated certainty of a woman who had lived long enough to be certain about exactly the things that mattered, that her granddaughter was going to be extraordinary. Not because of the Sterling name, because of who she was underneath it. "It worked, Grandma," Claire said. The wind moved. She smiled. She stayed for a while. On the flight back to Boston, she was seated next to a woman in her 60s who was doing a crossword puzzle in pen, which Claire considered the correct approach to crosswords and always had. The woman was stuck on 17 across. Claire, who had done crosswords since her grandmother taught her at age 10, saw the answer from the corner of her eye. She debated. Then she said, "Labyrinth. 7 across is labyrinth." The woman looked at her, looked at the puzzle, counted the spaces, wrote it in. "Oh, thank you. I was going crazy over that." "The clue is maze-like structure," Claire said, "but the answer is always the Greek word." "How do you know these things?" Claire shrugged. "I read a lot." "What do you do?" the woman asked in the friendly, idle way of people on flights. Claire said, "I run an investment company." The woman said, "That sounds important." Claire said, "It's interesting, which I think is better." The woman laughed. They talked for 20 minutes about crosswords and investment and the particular freedom of flying coach when you don't have to, and then the woman went back to her puzzle, and Claire looked out the window at the sky, and somewhere below them Philadelphia passed out of sight, and the coast appeared, and then Boston spread out in the afternoon light waiting. She landed. She took a cab to the office. She went back to work. That was the thing that surprised people later. Not the gala, not the disclosure, not the restructuring. Those things were comprehensible. Those things had a narrative shape people could hold on to. What surprised people was the afterward, the ordinary afterward, the Tuesday mornings and the cold coffee in the inbox and the analyst who needed questions more than answers. The plane to Philadelphia, the crossword woman, the dinner with Elena that happened on a Saturday in November at a restaurant on Commonwealth Avenue where they sat for 4 hours and talked about everything and nothing and laughed the specific laugh of people who have known each other since before either of them became what they became. People wanted the afterward to look a certain way. They wanted it to look like triumph maintained at a high pitch, like every day being the gala, like the woman who walked into the room continuing to walk into rooms at that same frequency of significance. But that's not what living is. Living is the work, the briefings, the decisions made in ordinary rooms for reasons that don't make newspapers, but matter to the people they affect. Living is Daniel Brooks, 2 weeks into his role as CEO of Whitmore Industries, calling Claire on a Tuesday morning to ask her read on a personnel decision, not because he needed her permission, but because he valued the judgment, and they had built in the months since that conference room conversation, the kind of professional relationship where that call was natural and appropriate and made things better. Living as Richard Sterling on a Wednesday in December, sitting across from Claire at lunch and telling her about the desk, about the one-room office in Philadelphia, where he had sat in 1971 with a very clear idea and absolutely no interest in being told it wouldn't work. and about the day her grandmother had walked in with lunch from the diner around the corner and set it on the desk and said, "You're going to need to eat something if you're going to build something," and about how that was the day he had known not about Sterling Capital, but about her. Living is Renata Voss on her first day at Sterling Capital, arriving 11 minutes early and asking the administrative assistant with complete seriousness which coffee machine was considered the better one, receiving a detailed answer and then making her coffee carefully and taking it to her desk and opening her laptop and beginning, which was the only way any of it ever started. Living as Evelyn Whitmore, 3 months after the gala calling Claire's office not to apologize again. The apology had happened in writing through attorneys, formal and complete and correct, but to ask with the stiff, effortful directness of a woman who is learning something she should have learned decades earlier if they could speak. Claire had said yes. They had spoken for 30 minutes. It was not warm. It was not the beginning of a friendship. But it was honest, and honest was more than they had managed in 7 years, and both of them understood that honest, however uncomfortable, was the only ground worth building anything on. Living as Claire on a morning in January, standing at the window of her office. Her window, her office, her city, with the Sterling Capital briefing in one hand and a cup of coffee that was still hot for once because she had remembered to drink it while it was, and looking at the skyline in the winter light and feeling the particular feeling that she had been trying for years to find her way back to. Not triumph, not vindication. Not the satisfaction of having been right about the people who were wrong about her, something simpler and deeper than any of those. She felt like herself, the woman who had walked away from $2.3 million without flinching, the woman who had slept soundly in a hotel room the night after she signed the papers, the woman who had stepped onto a jet at pre-dawn and flown toward the life she had been preparing for. The woman who had walked through a parting crowd and sat at a table and spoken the truth about complicated things with a steady voice, and had not once needed anyone in that room to validate what she already knew. Claire Morgan had disappeared in the Whitmore estate the moment she walked out the front door with one suitcase. Claire Sterling did not need a dramatic arrival. She had always been there. She had simply finally stopped stepping aside to let other people fill the space. The coffee stayed warm. Outside, the city moved. Inside, she went back to work. And that the going back to work, the ordinary Tuesday of it, the daily decision to inhabit her own life fully and without apology, that was the victory that no one photographed and no newspaper reported and no gala would ever mark. That was the one that mattered. The greatest wealth Claire Sterling ever built was not a portfolio or a restructured company or a 31-page disclosure that changed the balance of power in a boardroom. It was the knowledge earned at full price and held without compromise of exactly what she was worth. And she never let anyone tell her otherwise again.